They say, serenity is the sound of flowing water, a gentle, constant, assured cadence. For 23 years, that very sound emanated from the tranquil pool at the rear of my estate, nestled within the protective embrace of the cottonwood trees. It was a place where the verdant ground sloped softly, retaining its moisture long after the summer's heat had parched the surrounding earth into dust. It was not a magnificent spectacle, merely a broad, placid expanse of rainwater, reflecting the morning sun with a soft shimmer and emitting a gentle mist on crisp winter mornings. Yet, to me, it held a sacred aura. It was more than just a body of water. It was an intrinsic part of the land's natural cadence, a feature that seemed to predate the imposition of fences, regulations, and power-hungry governing bodies, and it was unequivocally mine. I acquired this residence following my retirement from the Army Corps of Engineers, back when my legs still possessed the vigor for a brisk jog down the gravel driveway, and I held a deep-seated belief in the virtues of quiet neighborhoods and neighborly respect. The dwelling rested on 3 acres, occupying the farthest reaches of a suburban tract known as Clearbrook Ridge, an ironically chosen designation for a community devoid of both a babbling brook and an elevated ridge, characterized instead by monotonous rows of beige houses, each adorned with standardized mailboxes and precisely 2.5 ornamental trees gracing their front yards. My parcel had been granted an exemption, a historical anomaly, predating the Homeowners Association's expansion of its authority in the year 2003. While more recent construction stood shoulder to shoulder on postage stamp-sized lots, my sanctuary was discreetly situated behind a dense hedgerow, partially obscured from the cul-de-sac, presenting as a vestige of a more authentic era. The pond lay just beyond my flourishing vegetable garden, a space where I cultivated squash, tomatoes, and corn, their stalks growing tall enough to cast elongated shadows over the delicate lettuce. During the spring months, the nocturnal chorus of frogs resonated through the twilight, and in the autumn, flocks of wild geese would descend, their wings brushing the water's surface before their southward migration. Children from the adjacent street would frequently surreptitiously navigate the rear fencing, eager to cast lines for bluegill or send stones skipping across the water. I never deterred them. The melody of their youthful exclamations was far more pleasing to my ears than an oppressive silence. But beyond all these cherished aspects, the pond held profound significance because it replenished the aquifer that supplied my private well. You see, the majority of the newer residences in Clearbrook Ridge were connected to the municipal water system, their consumption meticulously metered, monitored, and rationed. However, my property operated independently. My well tapped into a deep, stable subterranean reservoir of groundwater that had maintained a consistent level for decades. During periods of drought, when the city imposed strict watering restrictions and the surrounding lawns transformed into brittle, desiccated expanses, my garden remained vibrantly green. That humble pond functioned as a natural sponge. Every rainfall it absorbed, every trickle it retained, gradually seeped into the earth, effectively preventing the water table from diminishing. It was a testament to natural engineering, it was science, it was equilibrium. Yet inexplicably, no member of the HOA board seemed to acknowledge its importance. Initially, they maintained a passive distance, with only the occasional subtly aggressive missive arriving in my mailbox, perhaps referencing my non-standard mailbox or the faded paint on my garden shed, but nothing of consequence. I dutifully paid the nominal dues out of a sense of civic courtesy, even though my property technically lay beyond their purview. Then, a palpable shift occurred. It commenced subtly with the election of a new HOA president, a woman named Cheryl Denton. Her smile possessed the polished sheen of a real estate agent, and she wielded clipboards with the formidable authority of a seasoned commander. She embodied the type of individual who equated adherence to rules with moral rectitude, and who believed that property values superseded common sense. At the inaugural community gathering she hosted, Cheryl presented a discourse on the virtues of visual uniformity and meticulously curated landscaping. Her presentation included aerial photographs captured by drones, showcasing neighboring communities with immaculate lawns, perfectly manicured pathways, and not a single misplaced twig. She spoke of the aspiration to introduce a lake aesthetic to Clearbrook Ridge. When a resident inquired whether this implied the acquisition of a communal swimming pool, Cheryl responded with a disarmingly sweet smile, stating, "Not precisely." The subsequent day witnessed the swift formation of a committee. They commenced meticulously measuring property setbacks, cataloging architectural deviations, and systematically inspecting every yard, ostensibly for the collective betterment of all, as disseminated through community-wide emails. I largely disregarded these communications. My property was situated outside their stipulated jurisdiction, and I was not in violation of any ordinances. Frankly, I was too advanced in years and too weary to engage with a clique of suburban bureaucrats engaging in a charade of municipal governance. This continued until a particular afternoon when an individual clad in a reflective vest appeared at the edge of my property line. He remained on the sidewalk, refraining from setting foot on my land, yet he methodically photographed the pond with a camera as if documenting a crime scene. When I inquired about his activities, his sole response was, "Assessment for the HOA beautification initiative." That was the initial alarm bell. The second signal arrived a week later in the form of a certified letter from the HOA board. It declared that the pond constituted an unapproved landscape feature with the potential to adversely impact community cohesion and property values. The letter, politely, almost solicitously, requested that I initiate drainage and restoration procedures to revert the terrain to a more visually congruent state. A spontaneous burst of laughter escaped me upon reading it. I chose not to respond. Instead, I ambled down to the pond that evening, a steaming mug of coffee in hand, and observed the sun's descent behind the cottonwood trees. The water's surface perfectly mirrored the fiery hues of the sky, a soft and slow transition. Dragonflies, their delicate wings catching the light like tiny embers, skimmed across the surface. This was my domain. It was the final sanctuary my wife and I shared before the insidious grip of cancer claimed her. It was the place where my son, before embarking on his college journey, had successfully caught his first fish. It represented the singular constancy in my life, a steady anchor amidst the transient nature of post-deployment existence, and I was resolute in my determination not to surrender it to a cabal of self-important paper pushers, at least not without a fight. The first significant disruption did not descend from the heavens. Rather, it materialized in the form of a quarterly newsletter. 4 pages of glossy paper, folded with insidious intent, were deposited into my mailbox, masquerading as a community bulletin but emanating the distinct aura of a veiled threat. The newly designed letterhead boldly proclaimed, "Clearbrook Ridge HOA, preserving beauty, enforcing standards." Beneath this, a group photograph of the board members was prominently displayed. Cheryl Denton, positioned precisely at the center, her impeccably coiffed bob and disarmingly wide smile radiating an air of manufactured confidence, was flanked by 5 other individuals who appeared to have been meticulously selected from the same mold: neat, suburban, and eager to conform. Within its pages, the message was unambiguous. A new vision for the neighborhood was in motion, and this board was not seeking input. They were dictating aesthetic coherence, curbside uniformity, and harmonized natural vistas. The latter phrase lingered in my thoughts. Within that same newsletter, their latest objective was meticulously outlined: a landscape optimization campaign. The terminology evoked the sleek, forward-thinking language of a tech startup, yet its underlying implications were profoundly concrete. The HOA intended to re-evaluate all properties, yes, even those with grandfathered exemptions, to ensure their visual congruity with the community's designed aesthetic. The language employed was deliberately nuanced, legalistic, and manipulative, but its core intent was crystal clear. They sought dominion over every aspect, including my personal autonomy. It was therefore unsurprising when they initiated efforts to amend the bylaws, thereby extending their authority over the few remaining properties, such as mine, that retained their distinct character. The older residences, situated at the periphery of the development, had long been a source of vexation for the HOA, serving as constant reminders that their jurisdiction did not encompass every square inch within the neighborhood's boundaries. I was one of only 4 homeowners who eschewed municipal water, did not participate in their shared waste management contracts, and disregarded their prescribed lawn maintenance schedules and architectural mandates. I was acutely aware of their resentment. When Cheryl Denton pursued the position of HOA president, she unequivocally articulated her stance through hushed conversations and casual remarks: "We need to integrate all lots." While the majority of residents remained indifferent, a select few were swayed by her persuasive rhetoric. Once elected, she aggressively championed a universal compliance amendment, arguing that Clearbrook Ridge needed to project a singular, unified visual identity. The very phrasing of this objective ignited a visceral reaction within me. Inspectors were not dispatched immediately. That came later. Initially, they unleashed a torrent of communications, polite reminders, surveys, and requests for feedback regarding perceived problem areas within the community. However, the tone of these messages progressively intensified with each passing week. Subsequently, the door-to-door canvassing commenced. Volunteers, identifiable by their HOA emblazoned polos and accompanying clipboards, began their rounds. Most of my neighbors capitulated. I witnessed one of them, a young father named Marcus, sweet guy, reluctantly uproot 3 mature elm trees from his front yard simply because they were not included on the HOA's approved arboreal list. His 6-year-old daughter's cries were drowned out by the guttural roar of the arborist's chainsaw. In that swift, decisive moment, the shade provided by those venerable trees was supplanted by an oppressive uniformity. The transformation of the neighborhood was remarkably rapid. Overnight, lawns transitioned to an unnatural, synthetic green hue. Mailboxes were systematically replaced with identical units featuring integrated LED numerals. Garden beds, once vibrant and diverse, were meticulously sterilized into sterile symmetry. The community, as if collectively gasping for air, lost its very soul in under 6 months. Throughout this period of pervasive change, the pond remained serenely undisturbed. I could only surmise that it had become an affront to their meticulously cultivated sensibilities. Its perceived offense was not rooted in ugliness, but rather in its inherent refusal to be subjugated. It curved gracefully when they craved straight lines. It shifted organically with the changing seasons when they demanded static beauty. It served as a persistent reminder of something beyond their grasp, something they could not possess. Consequently, their attention became irrevocably fixed upon it. Cheryl Denton commenced her campaign subtly, weaving suggestive remarks into community meetings, such as, "We have received some concerns regarding non-conforming water features, and it is important to remember that natural does not always equate to safe or sanitary." She even went so far as to insinuate that stagnant water might foster mosquito proliferation and alluded to its potential to negatively impact residential property values. When I rose to address her at the subsequent meeting, intending to counter her assertions by explaining the pond's vital role in supporting indigenous species and replenishing the groundwater, she offered a thin, unconvincing smile and declared, "Well, perhaps it is time for everyone to be on the same page." It was at that precise moment I realized her motivations transcended mere ambition for power. She was, in fact, dangerous. Not in a criminal capacity, mind you. Cheryl was not prone to sloppiness. Her approach was meticulously calculated. She represented a unique brand of peril, one that expertly concealed malevolence behind procedural technicalities and cloaked nefarious intent within the guise of official protocol. She genuinely believed that enhancing the perceived quality of the neighborhood served as ample justification to disregard the lived realities of those who already resided there, and she was adept at garnering support. I observed it in the subtle nods from individuals in the back rows, in the passive indifference of neighbors who had once offered friendly greetings over backyard fences. One by one, residents began to prioritize their own perceived advantages over fairness, shifting their focus to what was deemed best for the community. Best, of course, was invariably defined by its impact on property values. I spent several contemplative evenings sitting beside the pond, meticulously mulling over the unfolding situation. The placid water reflected a myriad of images, my own countenance, now etched with the weariness of advancing years, a reality I had hitherto resisted admitting. The silhouetted trees against the starlit sky, and the distorted silhouette of a neighborhood I barely recognized. A part of me questioned whether my steadfast adherence to this place was merely an act of stubborn nostalgia, a futile attempt to cling to the past. However, my thoughts then turned to the frogs, the graceful herons, and the deer that habitually visited at dawn to quench their thirst. I recalled how my wife would often sit on the dock, engrossed in a book, and how my son used to drag lawn chairs to the water's edge, transforming it into a fantastical pirate ship. In that moment, I understood with absolute clarity that this struggle transcended the mere presence of water. It was a battle for remembrance, for the sanctity of place, for the preservation of the last vestiges of genuine connection in my life. Consequently, when the HOA board convened, and in my absence passed a resolution officially classifying the pond as an unauthorized water feature subject to mandatory remediation, I did not succumb to anger. I did not storm into the following meeting in a fit of rage. I did not raise my voice. I did not even deign to reply to their email communication. Instead, I occupied the dock that evening with a humble notebook and meticulously documented every detail I could recall regarding the construction of the well system. I recorded every measurement, every length of pipe, every subtle contour of the land. I painstakingly sketched diagrams, labeled elevations, and logged the rainfall data accumulated over the preceding 2 decades. I possessed knowledge that eluded them entirely. I understood the inevitable repercussions should they dare to interfere with that pond. They perceived it as a mere puddle requiring evacuation. They were utterly oblivious to the fact that they were inadvertently severing their own lifeline. Their realization, however, would arrive with stark and undeniable certainty. It commenced with a photograph, printed in glossy, full color, and captured with the intrusive precision of a zoom lens typically employed by individuals possessing either an utter lack of shame or access to a drone. The image provided an aerial perspective of my pond, artfully framed by trees in the midst of their autumn foliage. The water appeared darkened by the overlay of fallen leaves, with a few reeds leaning inward from the banks. This photograph was strategically placed on the second page of the HOA's subsequent community bulletin beneath a prominent headline that declared, "Visual Disharmony, a Case for Neighborhood Improvement." My name was conspicuously absent, yet it was unnecessary. Every resident of Clearbrook Ridge instantly recognized whose property was being showcased as a cautionary example, akin to a poorly behaved student on a middle school behavior chart. The photograph was accompanied by a caption asserting, "Unmanaged natural spaces can detract from community values and pose safety hazards to children and pets." The word hazards reverberated within my chest, akin to a blaring siren signaling impending danger. This was not merely an insult. It was a carefully constructed prelude to action. My pond was being systematically reframed, not as a natural ecosystem or an integral component of my property, but as a public menace, a genuine threat. And threats, as my extensive career in public service had taught me, were amenable to neutralization. I proceeded directly to the HOA office that very afternoon. It was not a formal office in the conventional sense, but rather a prefabricated trailer strategically positioned adjacent to the community clubhouse. There, behind a folding table, I found Cheryl Denton engrossed in typing on a laptop, its muted beige hue nearly mirroring that of her blouse. She looked up, her face adopting that familiar, disingenuous smile. "Mr. Weller," she greeted, "to what do we owe the pleasure?" "You owe me a retraction and an apology," I stated, my voice steady. "For what, precisely?" she inquired, her smile unwavering, her hands clasped neatly before her as if posing for a commercial promoting exemplary customer service. "You published a photograph of my land, private land, without my consent. You have labeled my pond a hazard. You are actively inciting the community against me." "We are merely documenting areas of concern," she replied smoothly. "We have a responsibility to uphold neighborhood standards." "You possess no jurisdiction over my property," I retorted, my voice rising slightly. I am not subject to your authority. Her smile thinned infinitesimally. We are in the process of unifying the community under a single consistent code. Grandfathered exemptions are anachronistic, Mr. Weller. They foster division and in the long term detrimentally affect everyone's investment. There it was again, the recurring refrain. Property values. It appeared to be the sole obsession of these individuals, eclipsing even their meticulously manicured lawns. Your relentless pursuit of uniformity will inevitably erode the very essence that imbues this place with any semblance of character, I declared, maintaining a measured tone. That pond is not merely some insignificant mud pit, it is an integral component of the aquifer. If you drain it, you will lower the water table. You risk far more than mere aesthetics. She raised her eyebrows as if I had just claimed the pond possessed magical restorative properties. I have reviewed the environmental impact report, Mr. Weller. The pond is not classified as a protected water source. I stared at her, incredulity momentarily seizing me. What report? I demanded. A third-party consultant, she explained. We commissioned a survey last month. We would be pleased to provide you with a copy. I demand the name of that consultant. Her smile resurfaced, a practiced defense mechanism. All requests must be submitted in writing. I departed, sensing that further discourse would only lead to regrettable pronouncements. That night, I meticulously printed the original land survey from the time of my property acquisition, alongside the comprehensive groundwater data I had assiduously collected over the past 2 decades. I dispatched these documents via certified mail to the HOA office, enclosed within a hard copy cover letter addressed to the Clearbrook Ridge HOA board. It stated, "Be advised that the pond located at 1899 Pine Slope Road is private property and does not fall under your legal authority. Any attempt to alter, remove, drain, or interfere with its structure will be considered trespass and destruction of private property. Furthermore, any manipulation of the local water table may result in civil and environmental liability. You have been forewarned." Weller. For a fortnight, an unnerving silence pervaded. Then, the flags appeared. Small, vibrant orange markers were conspicuously inserted into the ground along the gentle slope separating the HOA's easement trail from the perimeter of my pond. Survey flags. They did not inform me, nor did they knock on my door. They simply proceeded with their marking while I was away at the hardware store, treating my land as if it were a nascent construction site. That was the precise moment I decided to install motion sensor cameras. I was no longer willing to leave anything to chance. I was intimately familiar with the insidious escalation tactics employed in such situations. I had witnessed it firsthand in other communities. Neighbors transforming into informants, established boundaries becoming blurred, private property lines being redrawn under the cover of darkness. I harbored no doubt that they were diligently constructing their case. The subsequent HOA meeting was remarkably well attended. The community bulletin had evidently served its purpose, as a palpable buzz of discussion regarding the pond permeated the room as if it were a mythical beast poised to decimate their home equity. I took a seat at the rear of the assembly, remaining silent as Cheryl unveiled her next strategic maneuver, remediation recommendation number 14, unregulated water features. With a deft click of a remote control, the screen flickered to display a series of bullet points: runoff risk, mosquito vectors, drowning hazards. Subsequently, another photograph materialized, once again depicting my pond. This time, it was presented from ground level. The image zoomed to exaggerate the wildness of the cattails, rendering the water's surface appear ominously dark. Her intention was clearly to evoke an image of decay, but I understood her deepest fear lay not in its appearance, but in what it truly represented: untamed nature, autonomy, and defiance. I raised my hand, but she deliberately avoided acknowledging my gesture. Nevertheless, I stood. "I possess the deed," I announced, my voice resonating clearly, "and I have groundwater data irrefutably demonstrating that the pond sustains the well system supplying 4 properties, including my own." A ripple of murmurs spread through the assembled crowd. Cheryl offered a tight, strained smile. "Mr. Weller, This meeting is designated for the board's presentation. I persisted. If you drain that pond, you risk destabilizing the water table. The city's own zoning regulations explicitly identify this parcel as ecologically significant. Cheryl's expression hardened with evident annoyance. We appreciate your input, but the board will proceed with its planned course of action. On what authority? I challenged. She paused, then replied, We are acting in the best interests of the community. That phrase landed with the force of a hammer blow, as community was invariably the very word they employed to suppress individual voices. I surveyed the faces in the room, recognizing individuals I'd known for years. Some averted their gaze, others studiously avoided my eyes. One man, John, who had previously borrowed my ladder, offered a weak shrug, a silent testament to his perceived helplessness. I exited the room, but at that precise moment, I knew with unshakable certainty that they would not cease their efforts. This was not a campaign for aesthetic enhancement. It was an act of systematic erasure. They desired my capitulation, my assimilation, my surrender. What they failed to comprehend, what was utterly beyond their grasp, was that I had already initiated preparations for the direst of outcomes. I had meticulously stockpiled water, secured vital documents, and engaged a trusted hydrogeologist friend from my Corps of Engineers days to compile a comprehensive report. This was no longer merely about the pond. It was about drawing an unyielding line in the sand, a definitive stand I was prepared to make. And what they were poised to do next would irrevocably alter everything, not just for me, but for every single household residing on this side of Clearbrook Ridge. They were about to overstep a critical boundary, a transgression they would not comprehend until it was far too late. I recall the exact moment I understood they had committed their irreversible error. It was early, barely past 6 o'clock in the morning. I stepped outside, a mug of coffee in hand, and proceeded toward the rear garden, fully anticipating the familiar symphony of frogs, the gentle plop of fish near the cattails, and the soft rustling of ducks waddling from beneath the willow branches. But an unnerving silence greeted me. There was no sound, no water, only a vast expanse of thick black, decaying mud where my pond had once been. It was a sunken crater, its surface weeping moisture as if from a wound ripped open during the night. The dock, once a sturdy platform, now lay askew, half of its frame collapsed inward, resembling a man who had lost his very spine. I dropped the coffee mug. It shattered upon impact with the ground, yet I remained unfazed. It felt as though I had stumbled upon a murder scene, for in essence that is precisely what it was. Someone had infiltrated the darkness of the night and extinguished the life of the pond. My boots squelched through the viscous edge of the muck as I traversed the perimeter, my eyes meticulously scanning for any trace of evidence. It did not take long to uncover it. On the western side, ingeniously concealed behind the dense shrubbery that demarcated my property from the HOA's designated walking trail, I discovered a crudely constructed trench. It was freshly dug, a narrow channel approximately 18 inches deep, cutting directly through my embankment and leading into the HOA's drainage ditch. The earth within the trench was still damp, actively draining. There was no attempt to conceal their actions, no effort to refill the excavated earth. It was simply blatant, calculated destruction, and it was evident that this act had not been performed by amateurs. I recognized the methodology, the precision with which the earth had been excavated, the angle of the trench meticulously aligned with the natural slope of the terrain. Whoever had undertaken this task possessed an intimate understanding of their objective, and this knowledge filled me with a potent surge of fury. My anger was not merely a consequence of trespass, nor solely of the destruction of something sacred. It stemmed from the profound violation of having my own expertise, my own field of knowledge, weaponized against me. I stormed back to the house, my hands trembling uncontrollably, and accessed the security footage from the motion sensor cameras I had strategically installed near the trees. At precisely 2:17 a.m., the screen illuminated. 3 figures, attired in fluorescent vests and equipped with headlamps, wielding shovels, moved with an eerie efficiency. There were no trucks, no discernible lights, no engine noise, only the silent, relentless execution of manual labor in the dead of night. It was a demonstration of covert, meticulous, and unequivocally illegal activity. One of them stopped mid-stride, turning to face the camera. He was holding a clipboard, and on the back of his vest, a patch read, "Clearbrook Ridge Beautification Team." They weren't even attempting to conceal their involvement. I immediately contacted the sheriff's department, but when I explained the situation, there was a noticeable hesitation. "Sir, is this an active crime scene?" the deputy inquired. "Yes," I confirmed, detailing trespassing, property damage, and environmental interference, and mentioning their affiliation with the neighborhood's homeowners association. There was a prolonged pause. "Well, sir," the deputy continued, "you'll likely need to file a civil complaint, perhaps consult with an attorney. These matters typically fall under HOA bylaws or private arbitration." I ended the call. I wasn't naive. I'd seen this scenario play out before. Unless someone was apprehended in the act with a tool or a weapon, law enforcement generally shied away from HOA disputes, especially when the HOA possessed financial resources, legal counsel, and a convenient excuse. However, I had visual evidence, a history of their actions, and a fierce determination ignited within me, reminiscent of my time in Kandahar. I meticulously documented everything. I photographed the trench from every conceivable angle, measured its depth, collected water samples from the residual mud, and saved the video footage onto 3 separate drives, forwarding a copy to my legal friend Elena in Tucson. Subsequently, I drove my truck directly to the HOA office. It wasn't officially open yet, but that didn't deter me. I waited. By 8:03 in the morning, Cheryl Denton arrived in her white Mercedes SUV, sunglasses resting on her forehead like a tiara. She didn't notice me until I stepped out of my truck and stood before her driver's side door. She flinched slightly, then offered a smile. "Mr. Weller," she said, her tone overly sweet, "you're up early. You drained my pond." Her expression remained placid, but her posture became rigid. "I apologize. You dispatched a crew in the dead of night to excavate my embankment and alter the water flow." "I believe you're mistaken. I have the footage. 3 individuals in HOA vests carrying a clipboard, wearing headlamps. 2:15 in the morning. Precisely." She smiled again. "If any work was performed on community property, I assure you it was for safety purposes." "My pond is not community property," I retorted sharply. "You had no right." She maneuvered around me, her heels clicking on the asphalt, and unlocked the trailer door. "Mr. Weller, if you believe an impropriety has occurred, I suggest submitting a formal written complaint. Otherwise, I consider this conversation terminated." She closed the door directly in my face. I stood there for a long moment, my fists clenched. Then I turned and walked away, but my destination wasn't home. I drove to City Hall. Inside the Planning and Zoning Department, I requested all documentation pertaining to the Clearbrook Ridge HOA's jurisdiction, any amendments made within the past 12 months, and the original parcel map of my property. The clerk, a young man named Ryan, kindly assisted me. As he accessed the files, I inquired about any recent permit applications. He scanned the logs, then looked up, a perplexed expression on his face. "There was a trenching permit filed 2 weeks ago," he stated, "for a stormwater diversion project." My stomach lurched. "Who filed it?" He rotated the screen. "Applicant, Clearbrook Ridge HOA. Location, adjacent to walking trail, Phase 3. Purpose, drainage improvement to mitigate pooling and mosquito risk. Approved by interim city inspector. Date, Thursday, 4:42 p.m. They had obtained a permit for work on city easement land, but that easement did not encompass my pond. "May I have a copy?" I asked. He obliged. I departed from that office with a file folder full of evidence and a resolve as unyielding as concrete. They had presumed they could operate discreetly, that no one would resist, that I would capitulate like Marcus and the Elms, like every other resident in the neighborhood who sacrificed their principles for HOA approval. But I was not like them. I was the wrong person to provoke. I contacted Elena. "I'm ready," I declared. She didn't hesitate. Send me everything. We'll approach this from 3 fronts: civil trespass, environmental violation, and property damage. And while we're at it, let's involve the State Water Board. I ended the call, my hands no longer trembling. Out back, the pond remained a raw wound. But wounds heal, and sometimes they serve as reminders of what we fight for. It began with a cry, not the kind one hears in terrifying dreams, but the raw, exasperated howl of real life, emanating from someone turning a tap and getting only air. It came from across the cul-de-sac, from Miss Halbert's residence. In her 70s, she lived alone and had a habit of watering her roses precisely at 6 in the morning, a routine she'd followed every day since I moved in. That particular morning, however, instead of the gentle hiss of a garden hose, her shout pierced the dawn like an alarm. Then came a second outcry, this time from the Sanders household, 2 doors down. I heard their front door fly open, the distinct sound of flip-flops slapping against the pavement, and the unmistakable string of curses from someone who hadn't yet had their morning coffee or shower. By 6:15, the neighborhood was stirring in a state of agitation. Sidewalks filled with residents clad in pajamas, clutching coffee mugs and cell phones, frantically tapping screens and pressing buttons on devices that offered no solution to the unfolding crisis. The water was gone. No prior notification, no warning, no pressure in the lines, just dry faucets and an unnerving silence. I stood at my kitchen sink, filled a pot with water from the tap, and placed it on the stove for tea. All the plumbing in my house was still functioning perfectly. Excellent pressure, clear, cool water. My well remained unaffected because I had constructed it with deliberate care, shielded it, and designed it for independent operation. I hadn't sabotaged myself. I opened the back door, allowing the cool morning air to waft into the kitchen. From the deck, I could see the gouged-out depression where the pond had once been. The trench that had ravaged it was already showing signs of cracking at its edges, drying into jagged, unsightly fissures. There was no denying it now. They hadn't merely drained a pond, they had depleted the entire neighborhood's water supply. By 7 in the morning, the HOA group chat, a channel I had access to thanks to a neighbor who detested Cheryl as much as I did, was in utter disarray. Sharon P89 posted, "Anyone else experiencing zero water pressure?" Michael Ridge replied, "Yep. Faucets are dry. Showers aren't working." Jack Denton then posted, "We are aware of a potential disruption and are collaborating with the city to assess the situation. Please remain calm." The real John D. questioned, "Why is it only our side of the development?" I took a sip of my tea. Just then I heard the rapid, angry slam of a car door. Cheryl. She was striding up the street, clipboard in hand, her impeccably pressed blouse already wilting under the strain of stress. A small contingent trailed behind her. Rick from the board, that lanky intern from the landscaping crew, and a man sporting a city utility vest. They bypassed my residence. They didn't dare approach me directly. Their initial destination was the Halberts, then the Sanders, proceeding house by house, making notes on clipboards and engaging in hurried conversations. The group's confidence seemed to diminish with each frustrated homeowner they encountered. By 9 in the morning, they had retreated to the HOA trailer, and Cheryl was visibly agitated, pacing like a general on a losing battlefield. I stood at the edge of my lawn, arms crossed. She finally glanced over. Our eyes met. I offered no smile. I didn't blink. She was the first to look away. By noon, an official statement was disseminated. Clearbrook Ridge HOA emergency notice. Due to unforeseen infrastructure issues, portions of the water supply in Phase 3 are experiencing disruptions. We are working with city services to restore function as promptly as possible. Please conserve bottled water and refrain from using irrigation systems. Your cooperation is appreciated. It was such a transparent fabrication, it almost elicited a laugh, for I possessed precisely what they lacked: facts. The waterline maps at City Hall clearly indicated that this section of Clearbrook Ridge sat atop a shallow, sensitive area of the aquifer. My pond had functioned as a crucial recharge zone. Without it, the groundwater levels plummeted nearly 4 feet in under 24 hours. 4 feet was sufficient to deplete shallow wells and strain even the city's auxiliary water feeds. They hadn't just pulled a plug, they had fractured the entire system, and the most infuriating part was their complete lack of a plan to rectify the situation. That afternoon, I loaded my truck with several jugs of water filtered from my own well and drove down the cul-de-sac. I stopped at Ms. Halbert's, offering her 2 gallons and a smile. Then the Sanders, the Vasquezes, the Garcias. I didn't charge a cent. Not yet. But word spread like wildfire. The man with the pond, the one they had attempted to silence, was the only one standing firm. By nightfall, residents were lining up at my back fence carrying empty jugs, old milk bottles, even coolers. They spoke little. Some appeared embarrassed, others desperate. I did not turn them away. However, I also did not forget. Not a single one of these individuals had voiced an opinion at the previous meeting. Not one had defended the pond. Not one had stood between me and the board when they dug that trench like nocturnal thieves. And now they sought my assistance. Of course they did. Nevertheless, I filled their containers because water, much like dignity, should never be withheld. But I didn't stop there. That night, I unlocked the cabinet in my garage, the one labeled Archive. Inside were blueprints, military-grade maps, and soil surveys from my operational years. I retrieved the hydrology reports I had kept secured, cross-referencing the data I had accumulated over the years with recent rainfall figures. Then I booted up my laptop and drafted a report titled Incident Analysis, Unauthorized Drainage of Retention Ecosystem Resulting in Regional Aquifer Instability. I carbon copied it to Elena, my attorney, the Arizona Department of Water Resources, the city's Environmental Oversight Committee, and a local news outlet known for its coverage of HOA abuses. By the time I hit send, the sky had darkened and Clearbrook Ridge was facing its first truly waterless night. But I slept soundly, knowing what was imminent. And I was not the one about to be inundated with lawsuits, media attention, and karmic retribution. The first knock occurred precisely at 7:42 in the morning. A timid rapping, 3 soft taps on the front door. When I opened it, Cheryl Denton stood there, looking as though her composure had been thoroughly roughed up. Her neatly coiffed hair was frizzy at the ends. Her makeup had cracked around her eyes, and for the first time since she assumed office, her clipboard was absent. She clasped her hands together politely. "Mr. Weller," she began, her voice low and modulated as if our prior interactions had been cordial. "May I come in?" I stepped out onto the porch and closed the door behind me. "No," I replied flatly. She hesitated, then gave a slight nod. "I'll be direct. The board is cooperating closely with the city, but water restoration is experiencing delays. We're urging residents to conserve. Several families have mentioned that you still have a functioning well." I waited. She shifted uncomfortably. "We would like to request your cooperation in providing emergency water until the city systems are stabilized." The word cooperation caused my jaw to tighten. "You mean the same city system your board undermined when you drained the pond that feeds it?" I inquired. Her expression flickered. "That was not our intention. Our objective was aesthetic harmony." "Don't," I interrupted. "Don't pretend this was an oversight. You submitted the trenching permit yourself. You were aware of the pond's function. You disregarded the data. I warned you." Her eyes flashed. "The board believed—" "Your beliefs do not supersede scientific fact, Cheryl," I stated, "or property rights." I moved a step closer, lowering my voice. "You broke the law, and you broke the land." She shifted again, an uncomfortable defensive posture returning. "Mr. Weller, I understand your frustration, but we require unity at this moment." "You did not seek unity. You sought control." She remained silent. I leaned against the porch railing and glanced past her at the growing line of people on the sidewalk, their faces etched with worry, their shoulders slumped. "Let me guess," I surmised. "You want to establish a community water station managed by the HOA, presented as some feel-good public relations initiative?" She offered no denial. I emitted a dry chuckle. "You truly believe you can spin this situation?" "I believe people are frightened, Charles," she said, using my first name as a manipulative tactic. You should be too, I retorted, because this is not merely a temporary inconvenience. This is a systemic failure. Your board initiated it, and now you expect the individual you demonize to rectify your blunders. I am attempting to prevent widespread panic. No, I corrected. You are attempting to preserve your position. Her expression hardened. So, that's a definitive no? I met her gaze directly. You want water? Join the queue like everyone else? She blinked. I anticipated an outburst, but none came. She nodded stiffly and departed, her heels crunching on the gravel like a series of small explosions. By mid-morning, the line had doubled in length. I set up a folding table near the side gate, equipped with refill spigots and 3 large food-grade water barrels. I wrote a single rule on a dry erase board in bold black letters: limit 3 gallons per household, no exceptions. Some individuals offered quiet gratitude. Others avoided my gaze, the shame of their previous silence still hanging heavy in the air like dust. However, a few attempted to push the boundaries. One man, Doug Kessler, a board member, approached with a 10-gallon wheel tub and an arrogant grin. Come on, Chuck, he cajoled. We've got 3 kids. Just top us off. You have 2 children, I replied without smiling, and a sprinkler system that never ceased operation. He rolled his eyes. Let's not make this political. No, I countered. Let's make it fair. I handed him 3 one-gallon jugs and turned to the next person. Doug left, visibly annoyed, but he did not press the issue further. Word spread rapidly. That evening I received a text message from Elena, my attorney. City Council has initiated an inquiry into the HOA board. Water board requesting a statement. They want you to testify. I stared at the screen for a prolonged period. My intention had never been to become anything more than a man safeguarding his property. I was not an activist. I was not a politician. I simply desired tranquility. And they had compelled me into a conflict, but now they had provided me with a platform, and I was not about to squander it. The following morning, I received a letter that had been hand-delivered, without postage, simply slipped beneath my door. It read, Mr. Weller, we, the undersigned residents of Clearbrook Ridge, extend our apologies for the board's recent actions and the treatment you have received from our community. We support your endeavors to restore the pond and hold the HOA accountable. Should there be any way we can assist, whether through labor, fundraising, or testimony, please do not hesitate to inform us. Sincerely, 37 households of Clearbrook Ridge. 37 households, nearly half the neighborhood. I stood there for a moment, gazing at the signatures. Some names were unexpected, people I hadn't spoken to in years. A few individuals I'd believed had sided against me. People were finally recognizing the truth. I walked to the garage and retrieved the backup generator, which I hadn't used since my wife's final round of chemotherapy. I connected it to a secondary filtration pump I had kept sealed in a storage barrel. Then I hauled the coiled black hose to the edge of the now dry pond basin. If they were genuinely remorseful, if this wasn't merely panic-driven guilt, then perhaps a path forward existed. But not without accountability, not without the truth. I sent a message to the news station, ready to discuss, interview at my property, bring a camera crew. And for the first time in weeks, I felt something other than anger. I felt a sense of momentum, not just for myself, but for every individual who had been steamrolled by a board, silenced by policy, or shamed into quietude by the false idols of property values. Perhaps, just perhaps, this was the fissure in the dam. And perhaps, just perhaps, the flood was imminent. City Hall exuded an aura of bureaucracy. The air was excessively cool, the walls a monotonous beige, and the sound of footsteps on the tiled floor echoed like delayed decisions. But I was not there to wait. I was not there to request. I was there to unleash retribution. I arrived 15 minutes prior to the scheduled hearing, carrying 2 substantial binders under one arm and a flash drive in my pocket. Elena had meticulously assisted me in organizing everything: photographs, timestamps, video footage, groundwater data, legal ownership documents, city parcel maps, trenching permits, and a sworn affidavit from a hydrologist corroborating my assertion that draining the pond had directly contributed to the aquifer's collapse. When the receptionist inquired about the department I was visiting, I responded without hesitation: planning and zoning, then utilities oversight, and finally the public comment session with the city council. She blinked. All today, all before lunch, I confirmed. I began with planning and zoning. I placed the binder on the desk of a startled administrator named Marcia, who quickly comprehended that I was not a disgruntled resident with a fanciful theory, but a person armed with irrefutable evidence. She examined the trenching permit submitted by the HOA, the one that claimed to be for drainage optimization, and her expression shifted. "This permit was intended for runoff management," she stated softly. I gestured to the date stamp. "They filed this permit 2 days after I refused their request to drain my pond. They utilized a city-approved form to execute unauthorized work on private property." "My land," she murmured. "That was not authorized. That is a serious issue." "No," I corrected. "It is negligence with significant repercussions." I handed her a printed copy of the subdivision map, highlighting in red the location of my pond and illustrating how the trench extended into the HOA's walking trail. "Whoever approved this failed to cross-reference the boundaries," I added, "and now you have 37 homes without water and a neighborhood in freefall." Her fingers hovered over the telephone. "I need to contact my supervisor." "By all means," I replied. 15 minutes later, I was escorted upstairs to utilities oversight. There I met with a man named Calvin, a lanky bureaucrat with thick glasses and the weary expression of someone who had encountered an excessive number of incident reports in his career. I handed him my flash drive. He inserted it, navigated through the folders, and visibly straightened with each file he opened. "You documented everything?" he inquired. "I'm an engineer," I explained. "Retired. But the instincts don't retire." He nodded slowly. "And you believe this pond served as a recharge zone for your well?" "I know it did," I asserted. "My readings confirm it. It was the sole natural water retention area on this side of Clearbrook Ridge. The moment they opened that trench, they disrupted the equilibrium. The water loss can be traced directly to that incident, yet the HOA claims it was for mosquito control." I emitted a bitter laugh. "They called it an eyesore. They had a vendetta, not a vector." He sighed and shook his head. "If this is accurate, and it certainly appears to be, it constitutes an environmental disruption under the state groundwater management statutes." "Excellent," I replied, "because I am filing a formal grievance." He nodded. "You'll want to do that through the city attorney's office, but I will flag this internally and escalate it to our compliance unit." "This isn't going to be resolved quietly." "Neither am I." By the time I arrived at the city council chambers, word had already begun to circulate. Reporters were stationed in the lobby. Not a large contingent, only 2 local news outlets, but enough to attract attention. One of them recognized me from the viral HOA water crisis thread that had gained traction on the community Facebook page the previous evening. "Mr. Weller, is it true you warned the HOA about this in advance?" "Yes," I confirmed. "Do you believe the board intentionally targeted your property?" I looked directly into the camera lens. "They didn't just target it," I stated. "They trespassed, they vandalized, and they triggered a water crisis for 37 families, all because they prioritize aesthetics over scientific principles or property rights." "Will you be pressing charges?" I turned to the camera. "I'm not merely pressing charges," I declared. "I am pressing for the truth, and I will not cease until the board is held accountable for their actions." Inside the chamber, I signed up for the public comment session and waited. When my name was called, I walked to the podium and placed both binders on the council's desk with a resounding thud. The microphones amplified the weight of their presence. The atmosphere in the room shifted perceptibly. I had not prepared a formal speech. I spoke from memory, from the accumulated pain, from the ache in my chest where tranquility once resided. I recounted the story of the pond, the excavation, the clandestine crew operating under the cover of night, the day the faucets ran dry, the 37 signatures of support, the elderly woman now compelled to use bottled water for bathing, the children unable to flush toilets, the deafening silence emanating from the HOA trailer. I spoke to them about the hubris that arises from unfettered authority, about how bodies like this obscure their motives behind regulations and jargon, and then smear the reputations of those who established the very ground they now claim to safeguard. My concluding statement was brief and pointed. Clearbrook Ridge deserves far better than a governing group that depletes the vitality of its own residents. A moment of stillness fell over the assembly. Then one of the council members leaned forward. "Do you have any evidence to substantiate your assertions?" I gestured towards the binder. "More than you are prepared to examine." He inclined his head. "We will initiate an inquiry." As I exited the council chambers, the journalists were assembled. This time, their questions weren't about initiating legal action, but rather if I intended to seek a position on the board. A laugh escaped me, though inwardly I didn't dismiss the possibility entirely. Not yet. That evening, while seated on my rear patio, observing the barren expanse where the pond once lay, I sensed a perceptible shift in the atmosphere. It wasn't a meteorological change, but a change in the populace. I overheard my neighbors conversing once more, not about the latest directive from Cheryl or the designated shade for their shutters mandated by the HOA, but about how they might contribute, how they could cast their votes, how they could instigate change. The water had not returned, but something else had begun to surge, and I was no longer isolated. By the dawn of the following day, I was no longer merely the individual with the pond. I was a headline. Retired engineer retaliates after HOA's pond draining triggers water crisis. Clearbrook Ridge inhabitants left parched as HOA faces public outcry. From unassuming resident to community champion, Charles Weller takes a stand. Local Station 12 broadcast the interview I'd given outside City Hall less than 12 hours prior. They replayed the segment where I stated they had not only drained a pond, but had also eroded trust. This clearly struck a chord, as by 8 in the morning, my phone was inundated with voicemails, text messages, and emails from individuals I had never met, including veterans, property owners, and even civic officials, expressing gratitude for my defiance of those individuals. However, it was no longer solely about words. The repercussions were finally materializing. The mayor's office released an official statement that morning. The City of Largs has commenced a comprehensive review of the actions undertaken by the Clearbrook Ridge Homeowners Association pertaining to the unauthorized excavation and its ramifications on water accessibility for local inhabitants. While they were careful not to explicitly assign culpability, the underlying message was unmistakable. The city had been caught off guard and was now hastily attempting to distance itself from the situation. By midday, the Arizona Department of Water Resources had imposed a provisional moratorium on all forthcoming landscape initiatives by the HOA and dispatched a hydrologist to evaluate the compromised aquifer. And Cheryl Denton, she fell silent. No more community announcements, no more official statements from the HOA. Her customary Wednesday beautification walk was cancelled. Her vehicle was observed parked at the furthest extremity of the neighborhood, away from her residence. Even the board members began to defect. Rick, the very individual who had smirked through the vote to reclassify my pond, submitted his resignation that afternoon. His letter cited divergences in perspective and escalating animosity. In simpler terms, the pressure became too intense, and he sought to extricate himself before the situation became untenable for him. That evening, I received an invitation to attend a town hall meeting, not an HOA-sanctioned event, but one organized by the residents themselves. They convened at the old Community Recreation Center, a place I had not frequented in years due to an aversion to the smell of chlorine and insincere pleasantries, but this occasion was different. Every available space was occupied. Folding chairs were crammed from wall to wall. Individuals I had not interacted with for a decade sat alongside strangers, all nodding, murmuring, and clutching documents as if anticipating a revolution. A woman named Carmen, one of the mothers who had approached me for water with her young child in her arms, stood at the podium. Holding a microphone, she addressed the assembled crowd for an extended period. She declared, This board has operated in secrecy behind closed doors, operating under the assumption that no one would dare challenge them. That assumption ended the day Mr. Weller's pond was drained. The initial applause was hesitant, then grew in volume. "I didn't anticipate this," Carmen continued, "and I'm unsure of how to process it. We are here to reclaim our community, and we are requesting Mr. Weller's assistance in achieving this." She turned towards me. I rose. Not for accolades, not for authority, but because in that instant I grasped what Cheryl had always overlooked. People are not drawn to dominance, they are drawn to bravery, to integrity, to someone willing to stand firm when it truly counts. "I am not here to pursue any office," I stated. "I am here to facilitate reconstruction, not merely of the pond, but of the confidence, the integrity, and the equilibrium." I paused, then added, "However, I will assist you in taking every necessary step to hold this HOA accountable. We did not relocate here to be dictated to. We moved here to reside." This elicited a standing ovation. I, the reclusive widower with the well, the individual who never participated in HOA social gatherings, I found it difficult to comprehend. Later that evening, Carmen presented me with a petition bearing dozens of signatures, formally requesting a vote of no confidence against the current HOA leadership. Within that same week, Elena officially filed our civil lawsuit citing trespassing, destruction of private property, negligent disruption of ecological systems, and violation of municipal zoning regulations. And we were not alone. A second legal challenge was initiated, this time by 4 additional homeowners who discovered their water conduits had been adversely affected by the same shift in water flow. A class action suit was beginning to form. The HOA's insurance provider was about to face significant repercussions. The pond still resembled a gaping wound, but restorative efforts had already commenced. A local environmental advocacy group learned of the situation and offered their services to re-establish the wetland area at no cost. They enlisted specialists in native flora, hydrologists, and even a small contingent of volunteers from the university. For the first time in weeks, the ground did not feel tainted. One morning, I awoke to the sound of a young person excavating post holes for a temporary enclosure around the pond's depression. Another was gathering refuse. A third offered me a granola bar, remarking, "You're something of a celebrity." I responded with a slight grin, "I hope I don't let it go to my head." However, the truth was, I felt no elation. I felt a profound sense of relief, as if a long-standing burden had finally been set aside. The HOA board. They attempted a counter-offensive. A weak official statement claimed the board had acted with sincerity and was dedicated to the welfare of the community, but their assertions were no longer credible. Residents had learned to demand evidence. They had learned to resist. By the end of the week, the petition had amassed 120 signatures, exceeding the required number to trigger a special election. Cheryl Denton did not acknowledge the notification. She resigned instead. 2 other board members followed suit. In under 10 days, the established power structure that had governed Clearbrook Ridge for years had crumbled, and the responsibility for filling the vacant positions now rested with the residents. That evening, I stood at the edge of the basin. The sky was softly illuminated by stars, and the air was moist with the anticipation of rainfall. The pond had not yet been replenished, but it would be. More significantly, the neighborhood felt invigorated. Not perfect, not universally amiable, but vibrantly alive in a meaningful way, less apprehensive and more forthright. A young girl rode her bicycle past on the sidewalk and waved. I returned the gesture. The frogs had not yet returned, but I could envision their presence. The final desperate act of a decaying entity is invariably the most pronounced. The HOA board, or what remained of it, was not prepared to concede without a struggle. 2 weeks after Cheryl's resignation and the commencement of the pond's restoration, I received a registered letter. It was formal, legalistic, and entirely predictable. It was a cease and desist notice. The letter accused me of defamation, deliberate obstruction of HOA activities, and the dissemination of fabricated information that resulted in reputational damage. They asserted that I had instigated discord among residents and demanded that I retract my public statements or face legal proceedings. I sat at my kitchen table with a mug of black coffee, The letter spread before me like a tired joke. They hadn't even correctly spelled Elena's surname on the carbon copy. Nevertheless, it unsettled me, for I had witnessed enough conflicts to understand that a cornered adversary strikes wildly, devoid of precision or logic. Desperation possesses its own inherent form of aggression. I forwarded the letter to Elena. She contacted me 30 minutes later, laughing. "Textbook intimidation," she remarked, "and remarkably foolish. They will come to regret this." By the following day, she had initiated a countersuit, not merely in response to their correspondence but to intensify our original claim. We now sought full compensation for property damage, expenses incurred for environmental restoration, legal disbursements, emotional distress, and a formal court order prohibiting any future encroachment by the HOA on my property. Concurrently, public opinion had definitively shifted. The petition to recall the board reached 144 verified signatures, substantially surpassing the required threshold. The city announced its intention to supervise the special election. A slate of prospective candidates emerged, predominantly ordinary homeowners who had never attended an HOA meeting previously, but were now galvanized, informed, and prepared to assume leadership. The narrative had transcended my personal involvement. The story had garnered national attention. An affiliate of CNN aired a segment titled "Retired Veterans Pond Sparks Legal Confrontation with HOA Tyrants." Social media erupted with hashtags such as #DoodlePondGate and #ShootDrainTheBoard. The comment sections were flooded with individuals sharing their own distressing experiences with HOAs. I was invited to speak at a regional conference on homeowners' rights. I declined. I had no desire to become a public symbol, but I did agree to address a group of law students from Arizona State University who were specializing in environmental law. They were eager to understand how a community disintegrates when power is wielded without restraint, and how one man's pond exposed the system's inherent flaws. The day of the hearing arrived. We convened in a modest downtown courtroom. Elena wore her customary black blazer and carried herself with an air of authority. I wore a plain dress shirt and brought a single item, the logbook I had maintained since acquiring the property. It contained notes, measurements, rainfall data, and sketches related to the restoration. The remaining HOA council members attempted to argue that the pond had always existed in an ambiguous state, that the trenching was intended as a precautionary safety measure, and that any damage to my well or the aquifer was purely coincidental. Then, Elena rose and systematically dismantled their arguments. She presented the judge with video footage of the trench being excavated at 2:17 in the morning. She displayed the permit, which had been filed under false pretenses. She introduced expert testimony from a hydrologist confirming the environmental repercussions. She presented statements from residents. 37 households corroborated experiencing water loss. Her concluding exhibit was a photograph of the desiccated pond basin, followed immediately by an image of my dock collapsing into mud, resembling a tombstone. The judge required little deliberation. He ruled in our favor. The HOA was mandated to provide full restitution for all repair and restoration costs. They were ordered to issue a formal public apology to be prominently displayed on every HOA bulletin board for a minimum of 90 days. Legal fees were to be reimbursed in their entirety, and perhaps most gratifyingly, they were permanently barred from initiating any further legal action against me or my property without a court order. This was not merely a victory, it was a definitive judgment. As I departed the courthouse, navigating past the small assembly of reporters and neighbors gathered outside, I experienced a sensation I had not felt in years. Not relief, not pride, but justice. Authentic, earned, undeniable justice. Back at my residence, the pond was beginning to show signs of recovery. The nonprofit organization had assisted in regrading the basin, lining it with indigenous vegetation, and shaping the embankments to facilitate natural filtration. Rainwater had begun to accumulate once more. The trench had been filled, recovered, and officially approved by a state environmental representative. One morning, I stepped outside to observe a great blue heron standing motionless and majestic in the shallow water. It was the first time I'd seen one in over a year. I remained still. simply watching it. A gentle breeze rustled through the cottonwoods, and the air was damp with the promise of renewal. The HOA, now entirely reorganized, operated under new leadership. Carmen had been elected president. She contacted me the day after the election results were certified. "We would like you to serve as an environmental advisor," she stated. I paused. "You mean officially?" "Yes," she confirmed, "with full voting privileges." I smiled into the phone. "Only if we place the pond back on the map." "It already is," she replied. "We've renamed it Weller's Basin." I was speechless, filled only with gratitude and the profound understanding that everything they had attempted to erase had returned stronger than before, and so had I. It began with rain, a slow, consistent drizzle that intensified into a gentle shower, saturating the earth with a quiet purpose, the kind of rain that doesn't hurry, that lingers long enough to be noticed and is kind enough to be welcomed. By then, the trench was long gone, concealed beneath layers of new sod and native grasses. The wounds on the landscape were healing gradually, patiently, like skin that had finally ceased to be agitated. And the pond was returning, not solely due to the rain, the carefully restored topography, or the graded embankments. It was returning because we willed it to. Because for the first time since this ordeal commenced, the neighborhood was not in opposition to the land, but was working in harmony with it. We gathered on a Saturday, not for a protest, not for a vote, but for something more fundamental, something rare in a place where community had been supplanted by adherence. We came to contribute. Neighbors arrived with shovels, wheelbarrows, and work gloves. The HOA, now under Carmen's guidance, provided sustenance, bottled water, and tarps for rest breaks. Teenagers unfurled erosion netting. Couples distributed seed packets, and individuals of my generation offered direction, gesturing with calloused hands and expressing approval with nods. Someone set up speakers and played classic country music. Children splashed in puddles. For a brief period, it felt like a picnic from a bygone era. I had spent the majority of my life undertaking tasks in solitude. However, that day, I was not alone. People I had not conversed with in years worked alongside me as if we were old companions. Doug, the ostentatious board member who had once attempted to covertly bypass me with 10 gallons of water, appeared with his son and planted milkweed near the north bank. Miss Halbert, the widow who habitually admonished children for disturbing her rosebeds, distributed cookies she had personally baked, shaped like frogs and dragonflies. Even Cheryl made an appearance. Initially, she remained silent, simply standing at the periphery of the gathering, clad in a plain gray jacket and holding a small potted lily. Her hair was no longer perfectly coiffed, nor was her face. However, when our eyes met, I perceived something I had never noticed before: humility. She approached slowly and offered me the plant. "I never said I was sorry," she murmured. I accepted the lily. "Now you have." She nodded once and departed. We planted the lily together at the southern edge of the newly formed waterline. There was no applause, no photographs, just two individuals performing an action that should have been undertaken from the outset, respecting the land and each other. By mid-afternoon, the basin shimmered with shallow rainwater. It would not be sufficiently deep for fish for another few weeks, but the frogs had already returned. Tiny green specks clung to rocks, croaking in unison as if they had never departed. I sat on the rebuilt dock, my boots caked with mud, my shoulders aching in the most satisfying manner, and beside me sat Carmen. She handed me a thermos of coffee. "You know," she began, "there's talk of installing a sign, something modest, just a marker for what?" "To commemorate all of this," she said, gesturing towards the pond, "to remind whoever comes next that this wasn't always present and that it returned because someone championed its cause." I gazed across the water. "It didn't return because of one person," I stated. "It returned because people ceased to be afraid." She smiled. "Well, we stopped being afraid because someone reminded us how." I offered no reply, unaccustomed to such commendation, but I allowed the silence between us to linger, warm and genuine. That evening, after everyone had departed and the sun dipped low behind the ridge, I stood alone beneath the cottonwoods. The wind stirred the tall grass. The moon emerged from a patch of clouds, casting a silvery sheen upon the surface of the pond, and I recalled my wife, seated cross-legged on the old dock, sketching the waterline in her notebook, my son, knee-deep in mud, laughing as he attempted to construct a rudimentary dam from sticks, the sound of ducks at dawn, the ethereal glow of fireflies in July. None of it had vanished. It had simply been awaiting its moment, awaiting my cessation of mourning what was lost and my commencement of safeguarding what remained, awaiting our collective decision to abandon obedience and assume ownership not merely of our land but of our responsibility towards it. And now, standing there with the fragrance of damp earth in the air and a sense of peace settling upon my shoulders like an old friend, I realized something profound. They may have drained the pond, but we replenished it together. And what we have constructed this time, it will never be theirs to dismantle.